Her name was Robin. And Robin headed up and led a recovery group called Alcoholics Victorious at a church that my wife and I once interned at. She was a fascinating individual. She was one of those people that I was instantly drawn to. Robin oozed humility, and she was a woman of deep, deep faith. It was the type of faith where you knew that she fully believed that Jesus was who he said he was, that Jesus is who he said he is. Robin's heart beated for broken people. And her heart beated for broken people because she knew that she was one. I mean, Robin knew and owned what many of us, whether inside or outside the church, inwardly deny. That we're all busted up, that we're broken, that we all got our thing, that there's this bent inside of our hearts that leads us to think and act in unhealthy, destructive ways. I mean, Robin just flat out owned that. On this one occasion, Robin invited me to attend one of the meetings for the recovery group she led, and she wanted to introduce me to some of the people, and so I went, of course. Now, on this particular night, there were about 10 or 12 people there. And for the first 15 or 20 minutes, we just kind of hung out and we caught up with one another. We had some coffee, there were some donuts, and I got to meet some really awesome people. But I could not help but sit there in the midst of meeting people, and I watched Robin. I kept my eyes on Robin. It was just very interesting because she walked around and sat with all the different people in that group. During that 15-20 minutes, she went to every person in that group and she either talked with them, she prayed with them, with some she even cried. I mean, Robin knew all of their struggles. You could just tell, I mean, her compassion flooded that room. Now, I don't really remember the specific things the men and women talked about in that group, but what I do remember, I remember sitting there listening, and I slowly came to this awareness that I was no different than any other person sitting in that group. The only difference is that those people in that group had the courage to acknowledge their brokenness, their busted upness. They had the courage to acknowledge their specific addiction or addictions. There have been moments, whether in conversation or teachings, when I've made the comment and I've said, man, we're all addicts. Everyone's an addict. And it's interesting because people look at me and they just got that look on their face, and I often do that with people. They just have that confused look, like, where are you going with this? But from my perspective, it's true. We're all addicts. And we're all addicts because addiction goes way beyond alcohol or substance abuse. An author by the name of Gerald May says this: all people are addicts. The only difference is addictions to alcohol and other drugs are simply more obvious. And then May says this: to be alive is to be addicted. And to be alive and addicted is to stand in need of grace. We're all addicts. We've all got our thing. The only difference is that there are people who are willing to call it what it is. As many of you are aware, I'm a pastor, and I've worked as a pastor for 8 or 9 years now. Geez, I lost count. And I've worked in 2 different churches, and in both of these churches, and the one I'm at now, they have both run recovery group ministries. And I think these groups are critical. I think they're so vital and so necessary. My only concern is this. My concern is when a church hosts and runs a recovery ministry. When they do this, what can often develop among people is this idea that recovery ministry is only for people that are alcoholics or drug users. But what about all the other addictions? You know those addictions, the ones we just sweep underneath the rug. What about those? What about the addiction to work? What about the addiction to busyness, money, success? What about addiction to affirmation or praise or attention? What about addiction to maintaining this flawless image of ourselves, or the addiction of always needing to be right? What about the addiction of lust and sex and pornography? What about the addiction to consumerism? this endless buying of things we truly don't need. And here's one for you, and I'll probably get a lot of pushback for this. What about our addiction to technology and social media and cell phones and gaming? You know, we may downplay all these addictions and kind of scoff at these things. But one of the things we desperately need to recognize is that whatever we give our most time and attention to, whatever we let dominate our heart and minds, technically, that's a form of addiction. It's interesting, because in the scriptures, specifically in the opening passages of Genesis, we encounter a God who creates. And when God creates, he not only creates the world that we live in, he also creates human beings. And the scriptures are very specific. It says that God creates human beings in his image. I mean, we bear the fingerprints, we bear something, the semblance of the divine. Because we bear the image of God, there is this yearning, there is this desire that is built into us. There is this desire for God. I mean, whether one is a believer in Jesus or we believe in a higher power or not, we all have this desire. We all have this yearning, and it's a good thing. Because this yearning and this desire makes us aware that we are made for more than just this mundane, monotonous, selfish existence. Here's where addiction comes into play. Addiction, in the words of Gerald May, is this. Addiction is whatever supplants or takes the place of our desire for God. Addictions are behaviors or attitudes that try to fill the void. They try to quench that primal built-in desire we all have for God. And these are precisely the things that the God of Jesus wants to free us from. But the only way God can free us is if we drag these things out into the light. The only way God can free us is if we drag all of these addictions out into the light, out into the open. We confess them, we recognize them, we acknowledge them, and call them what they are. And God is just waiting for us to do that. God is just waiting for us to drag these things out into the open. It's terrifying to bear the soul. You and I know that very well. I know that very well. It is so much easier to just hide and bury stuff. So much easier. But it's only when we drag these things into the light that God can then flood our souls with mercy and grace and love. It is only when we drag these things out into the open that God can bring rescue and